Bet the board.
What do you mean you don't bet? I mean, I don't bet. You know, I don't gamble. I don't. I never have, and I never will. Yeah, right. I'll bet you $20 I can get you gambling before the end of the day.
You owe me 15 grand, pal.
Pay him. Pay that man his money.
It's the Bet the Board podcast.
God likes me. He really, really likes me.
In the end, I wound up right back where I started. I could still pick winners, and I could still make money for all kinds of people back home. And why mess up a good thing?
Here's Payne Insider and Todd Furman.
Welcome into the Bet the Board podcast. March Madness is upon us, and we make our pivot from the National Football League and college football into the college basketball hardwoods. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague, the one, the only Payne Insider. And Payne, I feel like we're two ships passing in the night. I have Stay Green with Chris. You're doing Cardboard Chat with Jesse. It's good to get the OGs back together after that Super Bowl recap podcast.
I was just about to say something similar because you said, as always, I was joining you, and that has not necessarily been the case.
I mean, this is what happens when you start to build a content catalog. You diversify the portfolio. I mean, you and I can't cover every sport under the sun, and I know you're going to negate my request when I go, hey, Payne, I really think you should be my co-host when we delve into the NHL, the NBA, cricket, international soccer. I know you're going to have a hard stop on all those various sports.
0.0% chance.
Much like Bluto Blutarski's GPA in Animal House, 0.0 to get things rolling. But again, for all those folks who are tuning in to listen to the two of us, encourage you guys to download the full Bet the Board catalog. Stay Green every week during the NASCAR season. And of course, Payne does an outstanding job with Jesse Craig of PWCC covering the sports memorabilia and the trading card space. But alas, here we are. March Madness, the field of 68 has been announced. We don't have 68 teams remaining as we sit here on a Wednesday morning down to 66, with Pitt punching its ticket out of the first four into the full field, and Corpus Christi outlasting Southeast Missouri State in one of the more bizarre basketball games you're going to see when you basically dominate most metrics, but you get outgained from the free throw line and you amass 30-plus fouls. So interesting way to kick things off. As we always do around these parts, if you're looking for bracket coverage, you're looking for our Final Four, I don't want to play spoiler. Not necessarily how we do things. We'll deep dive some of the marquee games that we have for you. But before we get into that, Payne, do want to get some of the generic topics out of the way. And I think a great place for us to start, knowing that you and the boys put together rankings and ratings that are airtight. When I look at the committee, they've gotten better over the years. They have more access to some of the data and the analytics. But there is no doubt
have they?
Some regions are tougher than others. And that, exactly. The floor is yours to try and pick apart how they've decided to stack the field this year.
I thought they did a pretty poor job this year, honestly.
It did feel like a regression from what we've had the last couple of years.
Yes. I feel like you're right. Maybe last year prior, there was like, okay, there was like one or two issues here. I think in terms of like teams that probably should have been included, overarching, my main gripe is there isn't a formula that we know exists. And some teams get docked for not ending the season well. Other teams don't seem to have a higher profile in the committee's eyes based upon how they're trending, right? You could have made the case that Vandy should have been in the tournament. Heck, I would have even made the case, my guy Dana Altman, with the history that he's shown in this tournament, the way his defensive schemes give teams trouble, that they were very much beat up early in the season and trended well extremely late. That's probably a team playing like a top 35 team in the country towards the end of the season, and then it won't look good because everyone's a prisoner of the moment. But I think Rutgers got jobbed, and I know they lost last night to Hofstra, so it probably is going to go on deaf ears, but I understand they didn't help themselves down the stretch. You can't lose at home to Northwestern and Michigan by double digits, but the profile stood out to me that they were elite in one sector of the game. I mean, it's a top 5 defense in adjusted efficiency, whether it's three-pointers, mid-range, near proximity shots. Rutgers defended all three of those areas at like a top 45 rate. They went 3-2 against our top 25 power-rated teams, and you look just across the landscape of teams that actually made the dance, that was more top 25 wins than the likes of Memphis or A&M, West Virginia, Maryland, St. Mary's, and Creighton. And, you know, all those teams are dancing. We actually had, prior to last night, Rutgers power rated 27th in the country. So it leaves you scratching your head, especially when, when Nevada is included in the dance. And I think, it's tough to make that case after losing last night. But, these are 18, 19, 20-year-old kids who get their guts ripped out on Sunday evening, and you think they're going to perform against Hofstra, 48 hours later and actually give a shit. That's not going to be the case. And we saw professional money come in on Hofstra, taking that from 7.5 down to as low as 5.5 some places. And, I even thought Rutgers, when you look at the vibe of that game, led by 5 at halftime, we're up by more in the first half, led by 6-7 in the second half, and then ultimately Hofstra charges late there, sends it to overtime and wins in overtime. But even like the vibe of that game was very much felt like it was controlled by Rutgers, just couldn't close out like so many games this season.
It's always so interesting because we fall victim to a lot of the things that you mentioned there. You look at conference narratives and figure out, okay, which league cannibalize themselves, which teams would thrive if they were in a lesser conference and would be able to amass more and more wins. Look, I love to see some of these mid-majors get in and make that Cinderella run. I think that's part of the romanticism about March, but at the same time, you do have to look at the leagues these teams play in, what they've actually been able to accomplish. And I think as far as Rutgers is concerned, when you begin to look at, their full body of work, again, go out there and maybe work a little bit harder sometimes to schedule some non-conference games, although this year they did play schools from some of the Power Fives that were out there, lost the game to Miami early in the year, lost to Seton Hall in an interstate showdown. But to your point, the narrative unfortunately goes out the window when you drop a game to Hofstra based on emotions more than anything else. I guess the logical segue to that, when you look at the most overseeded and underseeded teams that are out there, we know with a lot of the analytic sites that are there, you can ascertain at least a rough snapshot of how the landscape looks. And on the surface, for me, the West looks extremely deep from their 1 to 4 seeds. It was almost as though the committee went from a lot of people thinking that Kansas could be the number 1 overall seed in the tournament, which I think was a leap of faith, to going, hey, look, we're going to stick you with UCLA, albeit a Bruins team that's banged up. We're going to put you with a Gonzaga side who's playing as well offensively as any team in the country right now. And oh, by the way, just to throw a little salt in the wound, here's a UConn team that early in the year looked to be the greatest thing since sliced bread, went through a little bit of a lull in the middle of the campaign, and appears to be trending up as compared to an East that has Purdue, Marquette, Kansas State, and Tennessee. Quite candidly, 4 teams that I was looking to fade as early as I could, all thrown into the same group together.
Yeah, I think the West, if you're a pro bettor, is far and away the toughest region in this tournament. It's pretty straightforward too. It's by a mile, right? I mean, 5 of our top 14 power rated teams reside in the West. And I think there's some obvious questions surrounding Kansas with Bill Self undergoing the heart procedure, although he'll be back. And then you have McCullough dealing with the back injury, UCLA without Jalen Clark, as you mentioned there. It's a pretty big blow, but you look at what Clark brought to the table there. He was kind of versatile. He also had the second best offensive rating of any Bruin that played at least 65% of the available minutes. So it's a tough loss. I think your hope is that there was some good news, right? Their big man Bona is going to be able to play in the dance. It was nice seeing the freshman Amari Bailey play 2 of his better games the final week of the season, so he'll need to step up. I think it's probably smart if Mick Cronin gave David Singletary more opportunities within the flow of the offense, because he's been wildly efficient there. But even the rest of the landscape within the West, TCU is a fringe top 20 team in their own right. I know Lampkin is down, and maybe when you play a little bit more physical of opponent, having him in there would be huge, but the offense has become a little bit more efficient with him off the floor because they can spread it a little bit more. And you're basically have this matchup against Gonzaga in the second round. That seems pretty criminal to me. Gonzaga is certainly playing like one of the better teams in the country right now, and we think Arkansas can be a fringe top 25 team. I think it's very likely they send multiple guys to the league in the first round. I think we have them as a top 25 team. To your point, KenPom has them 20th. They're an 8 seed.
Must
so
bus,
this
baby.
is the toughest region.
Get on board the must bus. My guy.
That's your guy. I don't know if you saw this or not, and I don't believe it's there, but you were included at one point in his Wikipedia page last season.
I mean, that might be the first mention I ever receive on Wikipedia, so I'm going to take it, and I'm going to call that a moral victory. And as long as he's not cursing me out in post-game press conferences, it's probably a step in the right direction. But, Payne, what they say in media all the time is even bad publicity is still good publicity in the grand scheme of things. So if this is what Arkansas needs to inspire them to a Cinderella run deep into the tournament, I mean, their fan base loves to circulate the clip, and we're sitting here 3 years later. Hell, Chris Beard is even out of a job, or at least was, until he's going to become the head coach at Ole Miss at this point.
Ole Miss has an interesting hiring process. Just put it that way.
I mean, Kirby Hocutt down to Texas Tech is starting to draw a little bit of heat for his hiring process as well.
Yes, indeed.
But no, I think, talking about the West, I mean, hey, look, honestly, from a selfish standpoint, I'm thrilled because for the first time in the history of the NCAA tournament, we get the round of 16 and the round of 8 out here in Vegas. And I think regardless of how things go, if seeding is even close to holding, we're going to be treated to some fantastic matchups. And I may have to actually drag my ass out of the office and head down to T-Mobile. Although, I felt like I took advantage for the first time, given your pep talks, going to some of the smaller conference tournaments that were out there. I spent an entire Thursday watching Southland basketball in the Big West. No, empty venues, not the highest quality of play, but still was great to get out there and see some of these tournaments live and in person.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite weekends. Haven't been out there in a while, but you have the West Coast Conference, Mountain West, Pac-12. It was much better when the Pac-12 was at MGM. But you could kind of gravitate back and forth between the Mountain West and the Pac-12 and just figure out the better session and go back and forth. And, when we were younger, the crowd was quite appealing at that point because...
Oh, there's definitely some talent. There is no doubt. There are some that comes out.
More women that weekend than the following for the opening round.
100%.
By
depending on what programs are vying for a Pac-12 championship, having spent time down on the Harvard in the state of Arizona in Tucson, when they travel up in droves to Las Vegas for a weekend, it is not the worst experience. Now, all things being equal, that is the toughest ticket to get. And the UCLA Arizona ticket, a lot harder to get your hands on unless you wanted to pay a premium than if you wanted to go see Grand Canyon take on Southern Utah to win the WAC and some of the other conferences that were there. I should say the WAC, not the Southland, excuse me there. When you're looking at it, I guess Sam Houston State, a team used to being in the Southland, changes the dynamic a little bit. Before we get into some of the games, though, do want to get your take on the most overseeded team. If you could pick one from the rankings and analysis that you guys do that you felt the committee did a huge favor to by protecting them, at least in their opening round matchup.
I hate to say this, but I think it's probably Virginia. I love Tony Bennett, and I mean, we rode that Cavaliers team in 2019 to a national championship, but I think they're one of the more overseeded teams in this tournament. I mean, as a 4 seed, I can't believe the committee would actually think Virginia's a top 16 team in the country. I mean, horrific ACC conference, the worst Power 5 conference, and by a mile. You lose Vanderplas to injury, 6'8" senior who was pretty versatile. Virginia isn't overly deep to begin with. You looked at their, outside the top 25 in both offensive and defensive efficiency. They play like a snail, right? 360th out of 363 teams, and that leaves you susceptible in close games. They've shown a tendency also to kind of play down to the level of their competition, and Virginia doesn't have a ton of shot makers, so variance can rear its head late in these games. Not a single player on the roster that plays more than 50% of the available minutes has an offensive rating above 109, and candidly, Virginia is power rated outside of our top 40. So it doesn't shock me that their opening round game is priced the way it is.
Well, it does make you wonder, too, if Virginia ends up winning that ACC championship and beating Duke, do they potentially slide even higher as far as the committee was concerned into a 3-seed line? But you're right. When you look at Virginia's full body of work, this was a team early in the year that benefited immensely from veteran leadership. They gelled a little bit faster than some of their compatriots across the country. And as everybody else started to figure it out, you saw their level of play decline. And because you are a consummate professional, it allows us the perfect segue as we get into some of the marquee matchups that we have our eye on. And we may as well start there with a Virginia team that'll kick things off. 12:40 Pacific time, or 12:40 Pacific time, 12:40 Eastern time on Thursday, the opening game of the tournament against the Furman Paladins. Virginia, depending on where you look, anywhere from a 5 to a 5.5 point favorite. Total right now sits at 132 painted across the board. And as far as the Paladins are concerned, Southern Conference auto bid. They did lose last year in the conference tournament, a lasting image that hung with college basketball fans, given that instant classic against UT Chattanooga. They'll make their first tournament appearance in 43 years. You have to go back to 1980. Meanwhile, Virginia and ACC at large talked about their loss to Duke in the ACC title game, seeking their first tournament win since 2019. You started to touch on Virginia a little bit, but we may as well flip the script and look at Furman, a team that has 4 double-digit scores, have some veterans that can contribute it, highlighted by Mike Bothwell and Jalen Swanson, a team that is going to relish this opportunity, and by the looks of things on paper, at least fits the DNA of a potential giant killer.
I think this is just, why we're talking about this specific game is just, it's very interesting. And I think it is one of the games that proves how much the market has changed and evolved over the years, because 5, 6, 7 years ago, you're getting Furman +9 here, and casual bettors wouldn't touch them with a 10-foot pole. And now you're looking at this consensus price of like 5.5, and now everyone's thinks they're Nostradamus wanting to identify the 12-5 upset, and they're running over men, women, and children here at a shorter price. And that's how Furman becomes a little bit trendy. I can't completely disagree. Like, our number is like 4.9 in the game, just because, again, like, we don't have Virginia in the top 40. Theoretically, to your point, though, like, Furman has a shot because the game's going to be low scoring. Points are at a premium. Virginia might be the least athletic 4-seed or better in the tournament, so they're not going to overwhelm a double-digit seed like you'd expect. Furman has experienced contributors, and the one thing that we've seen in the last 3 seasons, yes, Furman plays with some pace, but Virginia doesn't crash the offensive glass. They want to get set on defense, and that might actually work here for Furman, because when they've tried playing up tempo while stepping up in class the past few seasons, they've been beaten pretty handily. But anytime that they've leveled up against teams that play slow, Furman's been in the game pretty much box to wire. You had Cincinnati in 2021, Mississippi State last season, Penn State this past November, lost those 3 games by a total of 13 points. Furman actually has a more efficient half-court offense in this game, so that's pretty interesting to me. You look at UVA, they like to pack the paint defensively. It's like no surprise. It's what they do. Furman likes to play a 5-out offense, hit jump shots. You look at Tony Bennett's defense, they're outside the top 250 in 3-point shots allowed per 100 possessions. They're outside the top 175 defending the 3-ball. So you can kind of see the path for an upset where the game's a snail's pace, not a lot of possessions, and suddenly Furman's hitting some threes. Virginia, again, is overseeded. The ACC's down. They play so slow, and they struggle with some of their half-court efficiency that they tend to not be able to separate. I think if you're looking at Furman being able to cover this game and maybe pull off the upset, it's because defensively they were able to maybe stay in front a little better than usual, and they defended the paint better than expectation. It's a very small team. That's the fear here. If you're backing Furman, they're outside the top 300 in near proximity attempts allowed. They're outside the top 240 in defending those shots at the rim, and that's ultimately, in combination with price, what's kind of kept me off the Paladins party here.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you look at Virginia. It was 2 years ago when they took on Ohio in their opening round matchup. Ohio was an extremely trendy underdog, and the Bobcats go out there and win that game 62-58 for all of those reasons that you mentioned. Virginia wants to shorten the game. They want to play limited possessions, and you open yourself up for a potential upset, especially against a team like Furman that ranks 12th in the NCAA in 3-point shot attempts per game. And while they only make about 34.5%, which is good for 154th, you know that they're going to get some of those open looks and be able to take advantage. But I think you're exactly right. When you look at Furman and try and figure out the one concern, it's what they're going to do on the defensive side. Fortunately for them, they take on a Virginia team that really lacks the kind of player of a DeAndre Hunter that was so integral in their run to the national championship and an ability to create shots. You do have some veterans that have been here before, but like you said at the top, highlighting the absence of Vanderplas definitely hurts for another big body that could change some of the dynamic inside. So we'll see exactly what we have here. A fun game to kick things off. off a Furman team who thought they should have been in the big dance a year ago. Well, they're not going to have to wait long to get some of those NCAA tournament jitters out of their system against the Virginia Cavaliers. Staying in the ACC, Payne, we may as well talk about the team that knocked off Virginia in the conference championship. That, of course, being the Duke Blue Devils, led by first-year head coach Jon Scheyer, who is a local boy, went to a high school very close to home for me, so I've followed his career as a basketball player and what he did in the state of Illinois back in the day. Glad he had the opportunity here, and for a Duke team that struggled early in the year, they've started to figure things out. They take on a familiar name as far as Big Dance Cinderellas are concerned in the Oral Roberts Golden Griffins. Right now, you're looking at Duke right around a 6-point favorite. Total in this game sits around 146, a game that'll take place in Orlando, Florida, and tip off Thursday night at 7:10 Eastern. When you look at Duke, backing the Blue Devils has not been a profitable proposition in recent big dances. 3-8 ATS the last 11 NCAA tournament games. ACC teams in general, just 15-34 ATS in the round of 64 going back to 2015. And while it's a very limited sample size, we've seen the last 4 ACC tournament champions struggle in their opening round matchup, going just 1-3 straight up, 0-4 ATS. It includes Virginia Tech losing their opener last year against Texas, Georgia Tech losing by 11 to Loyola as a 5-point dog, Duke dominating North Dakota State but not getting outside the number, and of course, the game that'll live in infamy back in 2018, UVA is a 20.5-point favorite, losing outright to UMBC. Meanwhile, Oral Roberts, longest win streak in the country right now, some familiar names that have a little bit of tournament pedigree, but they've played 4 games against Quad 1 opponents, 0-4 straight up this season, 1-3 ATS, were the only games they were dogs, looking at New Mexico, Utah State, Houston, and St. Mary's, but all of those came in a true road environment. When you're looking at this matchup, is there a path for Oral Roberts to be successful and match Duke offensively, or is this Duke team too big, too athletic that they'll wear down Oral over the course of 40 minutes?
It's a good question, and unfortunately, I think candidly, both teams got fucked here. I think this Oral Roberts team is far better than the team that made that Sweet 16 run in 2021, and just looking at our power ratings over the 2 years, they were well outside our top 120 then, and now they're entrenched in our top 70 this season. I think Duke, got graded for their full body of work, something I mentioned at the top, with very little trending data kind of mattering to the committee. It's almost like Duke upgraded on the whiteboard with Jon Scheyer while not having the overvalued cachet that comes with Coach K's brand. And it just seems like that's what the committee hung its hat on. Duke was pretty injured early in the season. Whitehead missed time. Then you have just the natural transition it would take for 5 freshman contributors to be more consistent. But I think Duke's been good defensively throughout most of the season. Offensive rating, if you look, is trending better. They've exceeded offensive expectation in 5 of the last 8 games. I think the question mark becomes what Duke team do you get away from Cameron? As I mentioned, 5 of Duke's top 8 contributors are freshmen. And because of that, you saw one of the more inconsistent teams in the country, a ton of variance away from home, played below expectation on the highway frequently, played to a road efficiency level outside the top 200. And what's kind of odd to me here is despite all the talent, and then you have a veteran guard in Roach, Duke doesn't have a ton of shot creators. They're outside the top 300 in points per ISO possession. They get very little from their big men in the post. A lot of Duke's offense is being more athletic and playing volleyball around the rim. They're 8th in the country in offensive rebounding and top 35 in converting those offensive rebounds into quick points. Oral Roberts actually does a solid job rebounding its own glass. Now they're going up a level in competition here, so that'll be interesting to monitor there. But I think your first question there, the main point is, I do believe Oral Roberts can compete. And I think the reason we've seen some money come in on Oral Roberts, +7 early on, is the difference in leadership. I mean, Oral Roberts is led by upperclassmen. Many of these guys have played in the tournament before. Paul Mills runs a very, very nice offense that's constantly cutting. If you look at Oral Roberts, they're second in the country in points per cut possession, and that's actually been Duke's Achilles heel defensively. They're outside the top 220 defending cuts, despite, again, being very good overall defensively. It's just the maturity difference, And I think, like most basketball games nowadays, like the three-point shooting is going to be massive in this game. Oral Roberts takes and makes a ton, second in the country in three-point attempts per 100 possessions, 351st in distance per shot attempt. So lots of jumpers, right? Now, make a ton of them, and you're going to be in this game, but Duke does a good job defending jumpers, defending the three ball. So if those aren't falling for Oral, I think it's probably smart with Duke's athleticism to try and get out and transition where they're substantially better than in the half court. I do think what's the more interesting element here, Todd, is whoever wins this game has a chance to make a run, because I think Purdue's a really overvalued 1 seed. We know the issues that they've had stopping dribble penetration the last few years just based upon who they have playing on the perimeter. And we know the Vols have trended horrifically even prior to some of the injuries, and we know that coaching staff hasn't been the most efficient this time of year.
Yeah, it's so interesting when you try and figure out paths for teams, and Duke was one team that you were hoping had a favorable draw and an ability to get there. I know they've trended positively as far as some of the mainstream narrative, and you can understand it. It's a team who's playing its best basketball late in the year when the games matter the most, and obviously from a game-to-game standpoint, that may not necessarily create some value, but big picture-wise, it could lend itself to some opportunities. Should be a fun game to watch. Glad this one is in prime time with a big brand, and we'll see if Oral can channel some of that magic we saw a few years ago when they made that improbable run into the second weekend, highlighted by, and headlined, I should say, by a couple of the same names on their roster. From that game that offers some star power and intrigue to a game matched up in Birmingham, Alabama that we've probably grown more accustomed to playing at 10 a.m. Pacific time on January 1st in the Outback Bowl between Auburn and Iowa. You're looking at Auburn and Iowa right now. We'll call Auburn a 1-point favorite. Total on the game down a touch, depending on what books you look at, but more or less where it opened at 152. This game taking place Thursday night, 6:50 Eastern. And the first question before we get into some of the X's and O's on this one, Payne, when you see a team like Auburn playing a few short hours from campus, do you make an adjustment in this point spread and build in a little bit of home court advantage?
I've gone back and forth with that, and
Alabama's
playing in that same building, right? So
a very good point. Could have a negative impact.
I don't know the right answer there, and depending on who I've talked to, I've gotten different feedback in that. We're all about the state of Alabama, so we're going to be rooting for Auburn if we're Alabama fans. I don't know if that's actually going to come to fruition.
Don't let anybody tell you that. The Auburn faithful are going to be rooting against Alabama, and it's going to be the exact opposite if those fans hang around. And as I look at the schedule there, the only good thing and a saving grace for the Auburn and Alabama fans, they're not playing during the same session.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure there. It's a good question. I'll be candid. Like, if we were going to do anything with it, it'd be a half a point at most.
Okay.
Now, you're trying to add up all those little factors that ultimately lead to something a little bit more substantial, but it's not anything major.
That's fair. And I guess when you look at these two teams from an on-court standpoint, it feels like the ultimate example of which do you trust more? A team with efficient offense that can leave a lot to be desired on the defensive side, or a team on the other side that shooting-wise has put up some performances that can, throw up enough bricks to build a homeless shelter down in that area. And this is an Iowa team and wins this season. They're shooting 41% from beyond the arc compared to only 24% in their losses. It's amongst the largest gaps in college basketball. And as efficient as this offense has been overall, their season averages fall in between some extremely high highs and some troubling low lows. Meanwhile, Auburn, not exactly in the best current form, lost 8 of 12 down the stretch, but showed they could compete and beat some of the best teams at points during the campaign. So when you look at Bruce Pearl and Coach McCaffrey on the Hawkeye side, how do you go about assessing which team you feel has an edge that they can exploit?
I think, let me just put this out there. I don't like the game. I think this was one of the tougher opening round games to break down. They're two polar opposite teams. It's why we're seeing a battle in this game. I mean, Auburn opened as large as a 2.5-point favorite. We're down to pick some places. You and I have talked off air, and probably wasn't going to say this out loud, and if I was, it probably should have been at the top. But I think if you are entrenched in the college basketball market and you're an actual player in this space, you know what's gone on behind the scenes. And to me, and it might not unfold this way in the tournament, but this has been one of like the highest variance seasons that I can remember in a long time. The sharpest guys in the world have not had a good college basketball season. And despite some positive variance for some of those groups forward facing, they've been drilled behind the scenes. And other groups that I respect and other professional bettors that I respect have not had a season up to par. So when you get a game like this, I just kind of throw my hands up and I say, boys, like, go battle each other. I'm going to sit this one out. Iowa has the best unit on the floor offensively, but they are a total sieve defensively. You have to question Auburn's offensive IQ, and that's been a reason that they've been trending poorly, to your point at the top. If they're smart enough to take the right shots and attack Iowa in the paint and at the rim, then they can win this game. I mean, Iowa's barely inside the top 300 in defending 2-point shots. They allow over 38% of shots to be had at the rim, and they're 198th defending those near proximity shots. Auburn just doesn't throw it in the ocean is the problem. So, like, the entire key to this game is Green and Johnson, right, with the dribble drive attacking the rim. And if that happens, Auburn should win. But if Auburn is dumb offensively, like heaving threes and mid-range jumpers, they're going to get run out of the building. And just what we've seen is Auburn's guard play is extremely erratic, and that's not what you're looking for this time of year. Now, if Iowa wasn't hitting shots, what else do they have to fall back on? They're soft. They're not overly athletic. They don't have an elite coach. Extremely poor defensively, as I mentioned at the top. And then there's this added layer of variance that comes in. If you look at Auburn defensively, 17th in core efficiency. They look like they're an elite defense. Super athletic. They're barely inside the top 30 in schedule-adjusted defensive efficiency, and it's because the SEC is dead last in three-point shooting as a conference. So it skews some of Auburn's defensive metrics, specifically the way they defend on the perimeter. So this game is just a gob of variance. There is a massive correlation, though, and it seems like that's how some sharp bettors have attacked this, right? If you like Auburn, you're looking under. If you like Iowa, you're looking over. So they've put them in correlated parlays, and that's how I've seen this game attacked. Other than that, I don't have a ton. Is there something that you can shine some light on that might give our listeners a little bit better of an idea here as they fill out brackets or potentially bet this game?
Well, I think what's interesting about this game, and to your point, I mean, two teams that want to play in very different fashion. I mean, the big headliner for Iowa has been Chris Murray, twin brother of Keegan Murray, who was drafted into the association and has broken out as one of the more productive offensive players in college basketball, but his current form, far from ideal. Shot under 42% from the floor in 5 out of 6 games. Not coincidentally, Iowa just 2-4 in those contests. Plays primarily off the ball, but shows the ability to take what defenders will give him when it comes to attacking closeouts. So we'll see how Auburn goes about trying to neutralize him. And when you mention Auburn, I mean, you highlighted their two key cogs in Johnson and Green. In wins this season, that duo averaging 0.96 points per possession over 24 possessions per game. In losses, scoring just 0.74 points per possession over 28 possessions in those contests. And obviously the difference in efficiency, again, I'm not splitting the atom here by any stretch of the imagination, has a lot to do with shot selection inside the arc. So if Auburn is smart, they're patient, and they're disciplined, they'll be able to get good shots. But this is a team that has to drive Bruce Pearl nuts because there is so much chuck and duck that goes on any given night where Auburn, if those shots are falling, look, they can beat the best teams in the country. We've seen it already this year, but they can also put up some duds, highlighted by that game against Tennessee earlier this year that felt like it set college basketball back 100 years, where neither team could get to 50 points. So it's going to be fascinating, and it almost feels like a game that avails itself a little bit better to live betting, because if Iowa is hot from the outside, I'm not sure Auburn has the offense to keep up, but if you see Auburn being disciplined, willing to work for those good shots, they should be able to wear this Hawkeyes team down, get inside, and use some of their athletes and physicality to get those easy looks at the rim.
And part of that's on Bruce Pearl. Like, he's not the most brilliant offensive mind. He's just typically has better dudes. But getting inside is one of Bruce Pearl's monikers. So hopefully that transitions to the basketball court in this game, and if it does, Auburn has a shot here.
We'll see what happens there between Auburn and Iowa. We'll keep with that SEC theme, though, and look at a game that'll take place early on the West Coast. Tip-off 10:40 a.m. Pacific time between Utah State and Missouri from Sacramento, California at the Golden One Center on Thursday. And when you look at this game, this has been the definition of a battle in the betting market. Utah State right now a 1 to 1.5 point favorite. Total on the game sits at 155.5. I mean, Utah State, the Aggies haven't made it out of the first round since 2001. This is the only Mountain West game that we have on our breakdown or deep dives that we're going to do here. It's a conference that has really struggled under the brightest lights in college basketball. Meanwhile, Missouri, they've taken care of some of the lightweights on their schedule this year. 5 of their 9 losses came against the likes of Texas A&M, Alabama, and Kansas. 18-0 record outside of Quad 1 this year is a big reason for this team's success and a massive turnaround, but a turnaround comes with a head coach that I know you guys hold in some of the highest regards. Dennis Gates has gotten more out of the Missouri Tigers this year than I think anybody anticipated, and a lot has to do with the style of play that they deploy and the fact that he was able to bring over Demoy Hodge, a key cog in what he was doing at Cleveland State, to kind of lead the charge on both the offensive and defensive side in Columbia this season.
Yeah, very much a transfer-laden team. A lot of mixed and match pieces that have come together pretty nicely, but I think this is one of the more intriguing games for me when you know there's a battle among pros. Very sharp money on Missouri +3, -20. A forward-facing group took +2, but there's also been some respected money on Utah State at pick that I've seen. I think if you like Missouri, your mindset, your thought process is, you've seen this movie before, right? It's a better conference, more athletic team, 3 wins against the top 25. Utah State has 0. The Mountain West, when they step up in class and get to the dance, hasn't been good recently because it's not an overly athletic conference and very few teams play tight pressure defense, and that's the one that has in that conference historically is San Diego State, and they run roughshod on the Mountain West. So how can I not take the points? If you like Utah State, it's because they've played the tougher schedule. They're better metrically. Both ends of the court contribute to winning, unlike Missouri. Utah State has played on the West Coast, and Missouri hasn't made it west of Kansas this season. And you think there's value fading the narrative. The Mountain West stinks and hasn't won a tournament game since 2018. So those are really the 2 surface-level thought processes for backing each of these teams and why the battle is ensuing here. Missouri's offensive game, when you look at it, it's pretty much about space and pace, which I think you alluded to. They play 5 out. They're super athletic. Utah State isn't. And despite the far better overall metrics defensively, Utah State isn't great defending one-on-one situations. Missouri has been damn good with dribble drive, creating penetration. They're top 25 in points per cut possession, top 35 in near proximity efficiency when that dribble drive gets them to the rim. But the Aggies do a pretty good job defensively because they play off the ball. Because their coach knows that they have athletic deficiencies, right? They rotate well. They try to push you off the 3-point line. They only allow 27 3-point attempts per game. That's, fringe top 50 in the country. But Missouri is going to have opportunities with open looks on the perimeter. They've done a good job knocking down those unguarded attempts this season. When teams do get 3-pointers off on Utah State, they're outside the top 200 defending that deep ball. So that's, again, just another variance factor here. Offensively, for Utah State, they're pretty unselfish. They spread the floor. They move the ball around. When they're hitting shots, it's a really tough team to beat, and I think it's wise if Utah State keeps this game in the half court where they're top 10 in points per possession, slow the game down. If Utah State can make this a half court game, I think that's their best chance, because if you look at Missouri, defensively, not great overall. But they want to overwhelm you with their athleticism. They want to pick you up full court, defend you the full length. They switch. They play this frenetic pace and style. They want to turn you over. They throw waves of guys at you. And Missouri is top 5 in the country in turnover percentage forced. Utah State outside the top 110 in turnovers offensively. And again, they don't see this style often. Now, if you can break the pressure, you can score in transition. And I think that's where Missouri gets a little bit sloppy defensively. 27% of Utah State shots come in transition, but I think they have to be a little bit more calculated there, because it's good to take the open shot in transition. You just don't want that to turn into a track meet the next 4 or 5 possessions because you did that. And then if Utah State can break the pressure, get their offense set up in the half court, I think they can have a little bit of success here against Missouri because they're outside the top 170 in both points per half, points per possession in the half court allowed, points per possession in transition. So I think there's opportunities here, especially if Utah State's hitting the three ball. I think what's interesting about Utah State is they have a pretty large dichotomy from when they're hitting threes, when they're not, like most teams, but it's a little bit more pronounced for them. Just a game, though, that I'm staying away from personally. And you know, I know you're watching some of these games a little bit closer than I was this weekend because you were in Vegas. I don't know if you made it to the Mountain West tournament or not, but what's kind of your vibe here?
I didn't, but when it comes to Utah State, you look at their full body of work. There was one team that beat them not once, not twice, but 3 times this year, and it's a side that you talked about in this handicap. It's being San Diego State. And while it's not apples to apples in terms of what the Aztecs do compared to Missouri, there are a lot of similarities there with their get in your face, the physicality, contesting shots. And the one thing, reading some of these scouting reports about Utah State highlights everything you said when you hear very passive guarding on the perimeter, but do a good job containing the ball and making timely rotations. Even though when they've done a good job in rotation, they do not contest three-point shots effectively, and they struggle when the action gets behind them, and they're not effective guarding one-on-one. That's exactly what Missouri wants to do on some level. And while we do have questions about the erratic shooting nature of what we've seen from Missouri this year, they have a couple of players that are more than comfortable trying to play ISO. And I wonder if Utah State has the players and pieces defensively to match up, not so much with Hodge, but more a player like Kobe Brown that can do a couple of unique things, that can make shots. He can drive closeouts. He can attack mismatches and contribute in transition. But I think you're exactly right in terms of watching this game. Missouri's going to be perfectly fine speeding up Utah State, allowing them to get easy buckets if Utah State is willing to play their game. If Utah State wants to pull it out and run transition and force Missouri to defend for 20 to 25 seconds, that'll pay dividends over the course of 40 minutes, and I think that creates their best path to success. But fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. And that kind of feels like the mantra for some of these teams in the Mountain West. Not the San Diego States of the world, although they haven't exactly achieved a lot of big-time goals or objectives when it comes to the big dance, but some of these other teams that just don't have the pieces. So I think from a styles makes fight standpoint, this game, maybe as much as Duke Oral Roberts, fascinates me a ton on Thursday, especially given the unique start time early in the day.
I know we've talked about this off air and maybe a few times during recording March Madness podcast, so I'm going to need you to help provide a refresher. But what was the year that the Mountain West sent like 6 teams into the dance? And one of those teams, was it like New Mexico or New Mexico State, was supposed to make a massive run. And I think a lot of teams like, that was the sleeper team. They might make the Final Four. And they busted out early.
I don't know how many teams they sent, but I feel like the team you're talking about is when Coach Muss was in charge at Nevada, and they completely crumbled in one of their opening round matchups. Maybe it was against Texas or they slipped by Texas, but I feel like it was that Nevada team that everyone thought had the NBA caliber players that was going to make a deep run. And that was going to be the team that could change the narrative around the Mountain West underachieving in some of the biggest games.
I was thinking it was well before those Nevada teams.
Oh, okay.
But I guess my point here is, like, one year they sent like a gob of teams into the tournament, and maybe it's pushing more towards a decade. And I want to say it was New Mexico that was supposed to be the team that was, the sleeper. The point is, all of the Mountain West teams busted out early, and the following year I go to the Mountain West tournament. And it's tough to realize unless you're on the court watching in person. These teams don't tightly defend at all. It's like a free-for-all. And you're just watching 2 feet inside the 3-point line. And you're just kind of seeing the level of athleticism, and you don't really recognize it necessarily on TV until you see it live. And all of a sudden the light bulb came on, like, oh, I get it. I now understand why the Mountain West keeps kind of busting out of these tournaments early. And I don't know if that's going to be the case this year. There is that narrative. I don't necessarily believe Nevada's a tournament team. I do like the profile of some of the other Mountain West teams. Like, I think everyone's getting a little hard on for, Charleston, and I don't necessarily, see that being the case. But This one will be an interesting game, again, as we alluded to at the top. Very much a battle dependent on price. 2 is a key number in college basketball, so we've kind of come off that number a little bit. I would be very delicate with how you handle this one now at 1.5.
And the other thing, too, and I know we don't harp on this a ton around here, but for a sport like college basketball, it is a lot more variance than even the NFL and the college football that we deep dive every week during the fall. There's nothing wrong going in, hey, look, this is the position I want. I don't have my number. I'm going to watch for 8 minutes, 12 minutes, or maybe get involved at halftime, because a lot of things for some of these teams that hail from different leagues that don't have overlapping opponents are going to present themselves and may give you the opportunity to jump in at a better number or go, you know what? I don't care that I'm not getting the best of it. This is a complete mismatch, and things are only going to get sideways before they get more competitive.
I don't disagree at all. I think that's a lot of what I'm going to be doing is live betting here, and just based upon the general synopsis that I've received this week, not a lot of games that some of the guys I respect like. They're going to be doing some live betting here, and really, you know, some of the larger positions. And I know, again, this is March Madness. Everyone loves this. Everyone partakes. A lot more casuals are into the market. But last week, conference tournament week, that was the week where you can really make some hay, because theoretically the decibel level is at 100 for everyone in this current tournament. Not necessarily the case a week ago, where teams have different ideas of how they're going to handle conference tournaments. And that seems to be the week where, you know, we make a ton of hay when I just look at the return on investment stuff and kind of sector it out at different portions within the college basketball season. Conference tournaments seem to do substantially better for us than the big tournament.
Don't tell that to fans of the UAB Blazers, who had everything to play for against FAU, saw a 5-point move and ended up losing that game by 150 points.
Box
there.
to wire.
Credit to the Owls, a game that just missed the cut, but I think should be an outstanding matchup when you watch Florida Atlantic take on Memphis on Friday. But 2 games that we do have.
What happened there, by the way? That's a committee snafu right there. I mean,
this is what the committee
Memphis
does. The committee doesn't like to play mid-majors that have played extremely well against power conference teams. They feel much more comfortable giving us that and then going, you know what? Instead of playing FAU against USC and Memphis against Michigan State, where you can bet both of the mid-majors that are going to be undervalued, they give the Blue Bloods, or the teams from the power conference, a free pass to the round of 32.
I know you just had a birthday, but I feel like you might be the right guy for Boston to hand the baton down to kind of carry this rant 20 years from now. But to your point, I think
he does a much
Memphis
better job with it than I ever will. I won't be able to ever hold a candle to what that man does from a rant standpoint and a passion and knowledge of college basketball.
I think, you know, one of the larger underseeded teams, like UConn was one of them, but Memphis, like I think we had them 20th in our power rating. They're an 8, right? I mean, the committee absolutely screwed FAU with that opening round matchup. And then again, obviously UConn was another team that got pretty screwed when you look at a potential second round matchup against St. Mary's, 2 top 15 teams. Just a joke there. But for another day, that is a very interesting first round game. I will let you keep us on course here and lead us to the promised land.
One last thing on that game. A hat tip to Penny Hardaway. I didn't know he was ever going to be able to get this team to play at a high level. And when you look at the landscape of the American Athletic, I know the dynamic will change as Houston makes its move to the Big 12, but they've been the one team that can match Houston athletically in that conference, and we saw it on full display, even with a Houston team that was down Marcus Sasser in the conference championship game. You can follow Payne on Twitter, @PayneInsider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, as always, follow the podcast for all things Bet the Board, college basketball and beyond, @Bet the Board. From Thursday to Friday we go, and Albany, New York will play host to VCU against St. Mary's. The Gales flying across the country for a 2 o'clock Eastern tip-off, where they find themselves 4-point favorites against the VCU Rams. Total in this game, 122.5. The Rams are looking to pick up their first tournament win since the 2016 edition of the Big Dance. Their last game against the tournament team, however, came all the way back on November 26th against Kennesaw State. The Rams, they go as their three-point shooting does. In wins this year, VCU is making 39% of their three-pointers they attempt within their half-court offense. That number dips to 25% in their losses. Not only has that hurt them on the scoreboard, but it's hurt them in the transition game as well, where so much of what they do is predicated on defense. But an underrated head coaching matchup here, Payne. Mike Rhodes on one side for VCU's team, led by Ace Baldwin, against the perennial performer or underperformer in March Madness and Randy Bennett, who has a team that looks on the surface to be a little bit more athletic than what we've seen in the past. Styles make fights, and this is the perfect illustration of East meeting West.
What's funny about this game is, we're obviously in March, middle of the month. There's been 67 data points combined between VCU and St. Mary's. One book opens 6, another well-respected book opens 2. Here we sit at a consensus of 4 as we record. So, kind of just there is the perfect example and depiction of the variance that we've talked about this season, that like after 67 data points, here we are, a 4-point discrepancy in opens from book to book. Metrically, I think this is the best St. Mary's team Randy Bennett's had. You look at some of their losses, 2 of them are in overtime, a third loss against the best team in the country in Houston by 5 away from home, 2 losses to Gonzaga, and nobody is playing better than the Zags right now. All the other slip-ups are close games. You lose by a combined 6 points to New Mexico and Colorado State. St. Mary's, far better strength of schedule. VCU was meh, right, against their non-con opponents. They only faced one of our top 50 power-rated teams and lost by more than 2 touchdowns, and that was early in the season, to your point, when Memphis wasn't really cooking like they are now, because Penny Hardaway's got that team headed in the right direction. Maybe, hey, we knew he could recruit his balls off, but sometimes you give guys in new positions a little bit of time to evolve. You just don't, hammer them right away. Is he like the most brilliant X's and O's guy? No, but he's, starting to come around from like one of the worst to like, below average. And that's a good step when you recruit at the rate he does. But my point is, like, VCU dominated a really down A10 that as a whole played to its worst conference rating since 2005. So, there's some question marks there. Now, I think this is going to be a rock fight. Both are defensive-minded teams. St. Mary's top 10 in defensive efficiency. VCU knocking on the door of our top 15. There's a reason this total sits where it is and has taken, a little tick of under money. I think when you look at some of the biggest factors, though, like St. Mary's is just better in the half court offensively. But the question becomes is, can they get in the half court frequently enough, right? Just totally contrasting styles. Mary's plays like a snail, walks the ball up the court, slows the game down. VCU wants to create havoc, right? Full court press, turn you over, and score points from its defense. St. Mary's has 2 good guards, right? Johnson and Mahaney. They're nationally ranked in turnover rate, so they take good care of the ball, although did turn it over a little bit more down the stretch and don't typically see the style of defense VCU plays in the West Coast Conference. The one thing I think you do have to give VCU credit for is this season they're substantially better playing defense in the half court as well. Typically it was very much just like pressure in your face, turn you over, but once you get into the half court, not as elite. That hasn't been the case this season. We'll see, though, as they step up in class if that continues to be the case here. But if VCU isn't able to speed Mary's up and make them uncomfortable, I think it's tough seeing a path to points for VCU, because you look at what St. Mary's does defensively, just so disciplined. And VCU likes to attack the paint, 5th in the country in near proximity attempts. If you look at VCU's overall shot chart, they've attempted shots 7th closest to the rim in the entire country. There's 363 teams. So everything is very close. Mary's does a great job preventing interior shots. They rotate very well. They understand the defensive concepts. It's not the most athletic defense, but there's some decent size. St. Mary's has been very good defending the shots that VCU takes most, right? Top 10 defending those near proximity shots. They do a fantastic job only allowing you to have one crack at the rim as well. 2nd in the country in rebounding its own glass. VCU also doesn't attempt a lot of threes, 332nd in 3-point attempts per 100 possessions, but they can knock some down. But they knock down like a decent percentage of them, but you just look at the rate and it doesn't really add up. And Mary's is like the opposite. They just don't let you take many threes. They run you off that 3-point line. So VCU, when you look in some of their losses, they've just been tragically poor from three, both in attempts and hit rate. And I think if that happens, then, Mary's probably has a decent showing here. Our number on this game, Todd, was 5, which is right where Chris opened. I know it's come down a little bit. Have seen some VCU money from maybe not the most respected group, but it did cause a little trickle effect into the market. I think, my instinct here is, Gonzaga is playing so well, and they drubbed St. Mary's, and it's kind of created maybe some value here in Mary's. I just don't know what to expect from VCU because they've only stepped up in class, as I alluded to, one time, and that was against a team that wasn't playing its best ball, and that team just absolutely run roughshod on VCU. So I think that's interesting, but very much some contrasting styles. Another game that I'll be eager to watch and potentially live bet. If that pressure is giving St. Mary's some trouble, then VCU's probably going to be entrenched in this game.
Just so
if they're not, right, and it's just slowed down to a snail's pace, VCU probably doesn't have much of a shot here to score points.
That's the whole thing. I mean, you look at this VCU roster, and while Ace Baldwin's one of 3 double-digit scorers on the team, averaging more than 2 steals a game, had just 2 games this year, coming on February 3rd against St. Louis and November 30th against Vanderbilt, where he scored 20 points or more. They don't have that guy that can be instant offense, that can create shots, that can be a dribble drive guy and give St. Mary's problems. And I look at the A10 from top to bottom, and this was a mid-major league that you typically gravitated towards because you thought there was a Cinderella here, or a team that was going to be undervalued. I just don't get that overarching sentiment in a league that was really down this year, how they're going to end up matching up against the St. Mary's team, who, to your point, comes in, maybe with a chip on their shoulder, knowing that they were drubbed in the West Coast Conference Championship game by a Gonzaga team that is trending in the right direction. So very curious to see where this number ultimately settles between now and tip-off early Friday afternoon out on the East Coast. Last but certainly not least, when you look at the Friday schedule, one of the perennial Blue Bloods will look to atone for a game that got away from them last year, that being the Kentucky Wildcats, who were unceremoniously sent packing by the St. Peter's Peacocks a season ago. Kentucky finds themselves a 4-point favorite. Total on the game, 144.5 as they take on the Providence Friars, a game that you can see Friday night, 7:10 Eastern Time from the Greensboro Coliseum in Greensboro, North Carolina. When you look at the Wildcats, they were the model of inconsistency this season. Lost 2 of 3 against Vanderbilt down the stretch. At their best, when they can protect the interior consistently, with a transition scoring margin of 7.6 per game in victories and -4 essentially per game in losses, Providence's ability to control pace will be a massive X factor for them, almost as much as any team in the country. Ed Cooley on one sidelines for a Friars team that was not playing its best basketball late against John Calipari on the other, who had a team that early in the year a lot of people thought could be on the outside looking in. They seemed to right the ship, but clearly a group cut from a very different cloth with a lot more veteran leadership wearing Wildcat blue than what we've grown accustomed to in the past, when it's a lot of, baby-faced kids out there that are freshman assassins, all with an NBA pedigree.
We've talked about the interesting games on this show, but they're mostly games within about one possession, and they're mostly games that have some battles. So again, like going back to that V word, if you're taking a shot every time we've said variance, you're going to be pretty drunk here.
Which is perfect to do, by the way, on your lunch break on a Wednesday afternoon on Tournament Eve. So we encourage all of that kind of behavior. This is technically like a Friday, right? You've probably already sent in for time off, and you told them 6 months ago and March Madness wasn't on their mind. They'll realize you're playing hooky, tomorrow morning, but they didn't in the moment they approved the time off. I think when I look at this, like, a group I respect played Providence plus 4.5, but it got to 4.5 because someone else respected laid 3. So again, we're like in this territory where there's just a wide range of outcomes, and you look at how Kentucky's played down the stretch, certainly like not the effort in their last SEC game that we expected, but played substantially better the last, 4 or 6 weeks of the season. But Kentucky doesn't go very deep. They play about 6 guys. A few of them are battling through injury. But Kentucky's A game is far superior to Providence's best. Kentucky also has like this nasty taste in their mouth. It's a little narrative based, but they got bounced early last season. Players have talked about it. Some of the coaches have talked about it. They're going to be pretty locked in here. And you look at Providence, they've lost 3 straight. They've lost 4 or 5 down the stretch. I understand the competition's been quite stiff, but it just started to happen
when the rumors that Ed Cooley could be headed to Georgetown. So that makes me, a little concerned there. The home loss to Seton Hall, inexcusable. I just, that's what makes this difficult. Now, if like Cooley and Providence are bought in, they're the far smarter team, right? They're way more calculated than Kentucky. And with extended prep and film, the whiteboard edge clearly goes to Providence. And Providence defensively makes you do things you don't like doing. And Kentucky has had questionable shot selection for a majority of the season. Like they just take far too many mid-range shots, the least efficient shot in basketball. But I think what's really interesting here, and probably why you've seen some, you saw the initial early Kentucky money. If you look at the teams that have beat Kentucky, it's really by walling them off and keeping them out of the paint and preventing them from getting shots at close proximity. Providence is extremely small. Only Ed Croswell plays more than 33% of available minutes for Providence. That's taller than 6'7". And like you get the guys for Providence. They're like super feisty. Their underdog mentality. They like to play physically. They do play tougher than their stature. But that lack of size is why Providence is 331st in the country in allowing near proximity shots per 100 possessions. Kentucky's top 5 in near proximity efficiency offensively. Post-up basketball isn't overly efficient in the year 2023, but it can be against Providence, who's bottom 5 in the country in that regard. So I just wonder if the athleticism, if the size, the length ultimately becomes a little too much for Providence here.
Yeah, it's such an interesting team. Providence was a team last year going into the big dance that people couldn't fade fast enough. They go out there, take care of South Dakota State, end up winning the second game, and we'll see. It's not the exact same cast of characters, but you talking about what's going on off the court with Ed Cooley, widely speculated to be amongst the front runners for that Georgetown job, no doubt has some impact in the locker room and may be contributing to why we've really seen this Friars team struggle. One injury, you talked about Kentucky being a little bit banged up. Severe Wheeler hasn't played since February 4th. John Calipari hoping he can give them some limited minutes, which would give them an extra piece at the guard position. They're going to need to get Reeves and Case and Wallace playing at their best if they're not only going to get through Providence, but achieve some of the potential and make a deeper run in the tournament. So a lot of things to factor in this particular game.
And that East is wide open, right? We kind of talked about it that, Purdue is an overseeded 1, Marquette probably an overseeded 2. If Kentucky gets it figured out talent-wise, they have more than both those teams. So, this is very much Kentucky could get bounced in the opening round, and it wouldn't shock anybody if they made it to the Final Four either. That's really, the variance within Kentucky and really not just, the East bracket, but this season in general. I think that's wide open, right? If you're filling out a bracket, I think, would it be stunning if either Memphis or FAU beat Purdue? It wouldn't be shocking to me at all. I understand Purdue metrically is playing better than they were last season, but I don't know if all of their issues like defending the perimeter have been solved based upon some of the guys they have. So, I think the East is just wide open.
Well, and the other thing about it, and I'm not going to discredit Kansas State or Montana State, who are in the other part of this draw. It feels like the winner of Providence, Kentucky, has a great opportunity to not just get to the round of 32, what they do by virtue of a win, but get to the Sweet 16. And once you start to play with house money, we know all of these teams can be a little bit dangerous. You mentioned Purdue's overall profile. I've watched probably more Big Ten basketball than any other conference throughout the course of the year. And Purdue, for me, doesn't fit the modern prototype for what you need to be successful in the Big Dance. Zach Edey is an absolute load, and he's very worthy of winning the Naismith Award like he most likely will be going to do, but the Boilermakers don't have the kind of guard play that you need to take over games. And if Edey is contained, which easier said than done, there is no doubt that there is a path ripe for the picking for somebody else on that side of the draw, maybe as early as that second round with an FAU team or Memphis to give Purdue absolute fits. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod. And Payne, before we get to the best bet, I did have one other question for you. And I know you talk all the time about market entry. We discuss how the public has their say when it comes to the NFL playoffs. Do you feel that's similar in the NCAA tournament where most public money will enter the market the day of Thursday or Friday with some of these books getting flooded and a lot of the movement we see early in the week? Some of it obviously very sharp, but true positions from the groups you talk to not being taken until limits are fully expanded? Or different this day and age?
The college basketball market is a little different, right? It's like mostly driven by professional bettors. Do I think once Thursday morning arrives first thing, can there be some public movement that causes books to adjust a little bit? Certainly. But college basketball is very much dominated by professional bettors in terms of its movement. The NFL, the public certainly has a little bit more of their say. But a tournament like this, certainly the casuals come out, and sometimes if you miss a number early in the week because another group got to it, you can sometimes find the second number because it's been repositioned back into place. The limits are higher, and it becomes that ultimate, debate is, my edge here at, was 3.5%, but I could only get a couple dimes down. It's now 3%, but I can get a 6-figure bet down, right? Like sometimes that's still a-okay, good to go. Throw up the two thumbs. So that's ultimately what you're dealing with here. But I think, overall, the college basketball market's very much dominated by sharp money and not necessarily the public, even on a week like this.
Makes sense. It's all the kind of things that you factor into the calculus, identifying market entry, figuring out the sides, and when some of the best opportunity to take advantage of sides, totals, props, and everything else happens to present.
By the way.
Yeah, fire away.
I like that phrase. I've heard it like 6 times in the last 2 weeks. Where's this coming from? I feel like someone's influenced everybody. I like the phrase, but I've just heard it recently more than ever before. What is it? Something about the calculus there. Factoring in the calculus. What did you say?
Oh, I think factors into the calculus of trying to arrive at some of these decisions.
Yeah. There you go. That phrase. See? Factoring in the calculus. Whatever
we try and sound smarter.
It was brilliant.
As best we can. Although, hey, look, the proof is in the pudding, and you can sound like the smartest guy breaking down games. And if a college kid goes 0 for 14 from beyond the arc, you look like the biggest idiot and don't get a chance to cash a ticket. But that is the game we play and the career path that we have chosen, which, of course, leads us to what we like to call the best bet and the most actionable component of this fine podcast. We know there are a laundry list of opportunities in March Madness, whether it's sides, totals, props, futures, etc. Where have you identified the best edge going into the opening rounds of the tournament?
I'll be honest. There was like a slew of games that you and I have discussed. There's a couple of games that I've discussed with parties outside of this, and we kind of whittled a few down. One of them got hit this morning before recording. Not necessarily too impactful of a number shift there, but some of the ancillary markets started open, started taking some decent sized bets, and that's ultimately where we found our largest edge. And I hate doing it because I think I texted you jokingly, like our cherished team has become quite beloved, and I don't necessarily like that. I like my guys
we were the
gritty.
Group Payne that were going to the small musical venues when they were an opening act. They were playing in front of friends and family shows for 50 or 60 people. Now it's as though this team has started to play Wembley, and they're on a Major League Baseball stadium tour during the summer months.
Well, they have, as I alluded to last year, because I think we broke them down in the Illinois game, they got some dudes, and they got some dudes that just don't care. And they're going to punk you a little bit. But I really like Houston to make the Elite Eight. You can lay $1.25, so your break-even point's roughly like 55.5% here. We have Houston, as I alluded to, as the best team in the country, power rating wise, and we give them a 65.5% chance to win 3 games and make the Elite Eight. This also, because I'm sure a lot of people will ask once they hear the podcast, they'll be in the mentions. This accounts for Sasser at less than 100%, but greater than 50%. I think he was very much held out as a precaution against Memphis. They did not need to win that game, get him healthy, buy him an extra week. I think he's going to be somewhere in that 80-90% healthy range. We've seen steam in the opening round game against Northern Kentucky. Iowa, as we alluded to, a little soft and doesn't play defense, and that is not the style that you want against Houston. Auburn has some issues, as we've alluded to, with some shot selection. Miami comes from a weak conference and isn't 100% and is extremely small. 4-seed Indiana is going to be in a dogfight in its opening round game. So I think, this is a very comfortable path to the Elite Eight for Houston here.
Hey, the Houston Cougars, a team that has everything break breaking the right way for them, assuming Marcus Sasser can return in top-tier form. We know where the Final Four will be played this year, and it's a team that's a bounce or two away from achieving great heights with Calvin Sampson as their head coach. Their swan song from a mid-major league as they transition to a Power 5. The Houston Cougars, widely available at minus $1.25 to make the Elite Eight. Payne, I have to ask before we bid the listeners a fond farewell and reconvene the same time next week to break down the round of 16. When it comes to brackets, what's your policy? Is it one bracket, kind of the bracket of integrity, or are you a guy that fills out 40 or 50, entering 1,000 office pools with people you haven't talked to for the last 15 or 20 years regularly?
I think you know that answer because you know my personality.
Well, I mean, I know the answer, but our listeners necessarily don't. Don't forget, we have new folks being exposed to Bet the Board since we joined OneTree that want to know Payne Insider's philosophy when it comes to March Madness and Bracket Mania.
So because there are multiple variants of March Madness tournaments that require different types of entries, I like to stick with just the standard. So I only have to do one sheet, and that one sheet will get dispersed to the 2 or 3 places that I join a pool.
I like it. I think
that's my mindset.
I think I'm going to make the plunge this year. I have never done an NCAA tournament survivor pool. I think I'm going to try that. Low stakes, messing around with some buddies that invited me into one. So I'm sure I will be racking my brain with strategy, trying to figure out how exactly to not paint myself into a corner by getting the Elite Eight and still having some potential outs to actually win the whole damn thing.
I'd be interested to hear how that goes. Feel free to shoot me a note if you need any help.
We'll do what we can, and I'm sure by this time next week I'll be able to tell all our loyal listeners I've been bumped before we even got to the round of 32, because that's how these things tend to work themselves out for me in a variety of capacities. But thanks, as always, to all of our loyal listeners who tune in for the variety of podcasts we're doing these days, continuing to grow the content catalog with deep dives that you can only expect to hear from these parts with Bet the Board. So whether you're into NASCAR or you're not, still in great investing opportunities at the track. Whether or not you're into sports memorabilia and trading cards, check out Cardboard Chat, a great perspective with which to look at the sports betting marketplace of sorts through a variety of ways, and we'll be with you every step of the way throughout the NCAA tournament with the round of 16 coming to you next Wednesday and the Final Four at a future date. So for Payne Insider, I'm Todd Furman. Best of luck with all of your round 1 and round 2 selections, and most importantly, with the Houston Cougars to the Elite Eight ticket in hand. Hopefully we'll see you at the window.
Thanks for listening to Bet the Board. You can catch Todd and Payne every Monday, Wednesday, and Thursday during football season, breaking down the biggest NFL and college football games. And to make sure you don't miss any free best bets, subscribe to Bet the Board on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts.